Welcome back. Hello friend, about 85% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I decided to take my uncle and his son camping for the weekend. Nothing special, just a small spot near a lake about 2 hours from the city. I figured it'd be nice to get away for a bit, do something different. The drive was quiet, just long stretches of road and trees on both sides. When we got to the campsite, it looked great. We put up our tent, got a fire going, and settled into the feeling of being outside. The first night went by without any problems. The stars were out, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the water hitting the shore of the lake. It was the kind of quiet that you don't find often. My uncle's son was excited, especially about fishing the next morning. The next day was calm. We spent most of it by the water, fishing and cooking up what we caught. It was nice, but something felt a bit off to me. I couldn't figure out why, but I had this feeling like something wasn't right. I didn't want to say anything, so I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just from being out in the woods. By the time the sun started setting, we were getting ready for the night. It was way quieter than the night before, which was weird. Usually, the forest is full of noises at night, but this time, it felt too still. The fire popped and cracked, but other than that, there wasn't much sound. The silence felt thick, like something was hanging in the air. I tried not to think about it and just focused on the warmth from the fire. After a while, we went into the tent to sleep. The moonlight was shining through the thin walls of the tent, but I didn't really pay attention. I was tired and fell asleep fast. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why I woke up. It was that feeling you get when you just know something's off. I lay still, listening carefully. My uncle and his son were both asleep, breathing softly. Everything seemed normal, so I tried to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps outside the tent. My heart started racing. I thought it might have been an animal, but the way the steps sounded, it wasn't. They were too careful, too slow. Whoever was out there was walking on purpose, not like some deer stumbling through the woods. I stayed completely still, listening as the steps came closer. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, listening to the dirt shift under someone's feet. They didn't move for what felt like forever. It was like they were just standing there, waiting. I didn't dare look at the tent walls, afraid I'd see a shadow or something worse. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I even took a breath. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening for any sound, but the footsteps didn't come back. When morning finally came, I stepped outside the tent, trying to see if I just imagined everything. But I didn't. There were fresh footprints all around our tent, clear as day. They circled around our camp and then disappeared into the trees. I didn't want to scare my uncle and his son, so I didn't say anything, but I knew we needed to leave. We packed up fast, and by mid-morning we were driving back home. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us the whole time. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road, but there was nothing. To this day, I still think about that night. Whoever it was, they didn't take anything, didn't try to hurt us, but they were there watching us. I don't know what they wanted, but the thought that someone was that close, just standing there in the dark, makes my skin crawl. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, knowing they were so close and we never even saw them. And I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next person to fall asleep. I signed up to help with a search in the national forest. A man had gone missing, and word was he was running from the cops after doing something really bad. The police were searching the area but needed more people to cover the woods, and I thought I'd lend a hand. They split us into small groups and sent us to different parts of the forest to make sure we didn't miss anything. Each group was given an area to search, and if we didn't finish before dark, we had to camp for the night. My group had a couple of people who were used to hiking, plus a cop who stayed with us to make sure we stayed on track. I had camped before, but this was different. Knowing there was a criminal somewhere in the woods made it hard to stay calm. The first day dragged on without much happening. We walked through the trees, looking for any sign of the guy, but the forest was thick, and it felt like we weren't getting anywhere. As the sun started going down, we still hadn't found a single clue. The cop called in to report where we were and said we'd have to camp for the night. We found a small open spot near a creek and set up our tents. The cop started a fire, but no one was really relaxed. We all knew the man could be somewhere nearby. He was dangerous and desperate. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us, maybe closer than we thought. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time the leaves rustled or I heard a branch snap, I tensed up. I lay there in my tent, staring up, just waiting for something to happen, ready to jump up at the smallest noise. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the sound got heavier, like someone was slowly moving around. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent. Outside, it was dark, and I couldn't see much except the shadows of the trees under the faint moonlight. That's when I saw a shape standing at the edge of our camp, barely visible in the dark. I quickly turned off the flashlight and stayed still, hoping they hadn't seen me. The figure didn't move. It stood there, not making a sound, like it was waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move a muscle. After what felt like forever, the figure turned and slowly disappeared into the woods. I sat there, frozen, trying to understand what I had just seen. It wasn't one of us. No one would be walking around like that in the middle of the night. I thought about waking the others, but decided to wait until morning. I didn't want to make things worse. The first light, I told the cop what I saw. He called it in right away. Within an hour, more search teams came. They found fresh footprints in the dirt near where the figure had been, leading away into the trees. The man had been there watching us. He had been so close the whole time. We didn't know it, but he had been sizing us up, probably waiting for the right moment to do something. The search in our area was called off, and they led us out of the woods. They didn't tell us if they ever found him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. The fact that he had been so close, standing there in the dark, just watching us, sent chills through me. That night, he could have easily come into our camp, and none of us would have been ready. We would have been sitting ducks. As I packed my stuff and left, I kept glancing back at the trees, half expecting to see him again, standing there, hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty forest stretching out for miles. It felt wrong, like the woods were hiding something, like we hadn't escaped at all, just barely delayed whatever was coming. Maybe he was still out there, somewhere watching us leave, waiting for the next person who wouldn't be so lucky. After the divorce, I didn't see my dad much. When he suggested a camping trip, I thought it might be a good way to spend time together again. My mom had moved on quickly, and I didn't see her often either. Dad found a small cabin in the woods for us. It wasn't far from the road, but it felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. All you could see were trees and dirt paths, and all you could hear were birds. It seemed like the perfect place to forget everything that had happened. The first day went smoothly. We built a fire, unpacked our stuff, and just enjoyed the quiet. By the time the sun went down, the fire was burning, and I felt relaxed for the first time in a long while. But the next day felt off. It was little things at first. The air seemed different, heavier somehow, and it got really quiet in the afternoon. Even the birds had stopped making noise. I tried to ignore it, but as the day went on, I started to feel on edge. Dad didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was wrong. That evening, I went out to grab some wood for the fire, and that's when I saw it. There were boot prints in the dirt near our camp, but they didn't belong to us. They were fresh, like someone had just walked by. I stared at them, trying to figure out who they could belong to. We hadn't seen a single person since we arrived. I showed them to my dad, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably someone who came through earlier. I wanted to believe him, but something about those prints felt wrong. They were too close to where we were staying, too fresh. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to every tiny noise outside. The fire popping, the wind moving through the trees, and then footsteps. They were slow, steady, and coming from the woods. My body froze. I could hear them getting closer, crunching through the leaves and twigs. They stopped right outside the cabin. My heart was racing so fast I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I just stared up at the ceiling, waiting. The footsteps didn't move for what felt like hours. I could feel someone was out there, standing right by the door, watching us. But they never came inside. In the morning, I checked around the camp. There were more boot prints, and this time, they circled our whole campsite. Dad told me it was probably just an animal, but I knew better. These weren't animal tracks. Someone had been walking around while we slept. We packed up that day and left early. The entire ride home, I couldn't stop thinking about the prints. I kept looking back at the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us drive away. But there was no one. When we finally made it home, I thought the feeling of being watched would go away. But it didn't. Even now, sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I hear those same footsteps. Slow, steady, and getting closer. It makes me wonder if we really left them behind, or if they're still following me. My grandmother and I had been talking about going camping in France for months. We wanted to find a quiet place, far from people and towns, where we could relax. We finally found a good spot in the countryside. It was a flat, open area surrounded by trees, with a small river nearby. It looked perfect for a few nights. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and enjoyed the quiet. As it got dark, the air cooled down quickly, so we sat closer to the fire to stay warm. The stars were brighter than I had ever seen, and it felt like we were completely alone, miles from anyone. On the second day, I decided to take a walk through the woods nearby. My grandmother stayed at the camp to rest. I didn't wander too far, just far enough to feel surrounded by the trees. The deeper I walked into the woods, the thicker the trees became. It felt peaceful, the kind of stillness that makes you feel calm. At one point, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of leaves moving. It was just dead silence. I stopped walking and stood still, looking around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I kept going. I told myself it was probably just the time of day, nothing to worry about. But as I walked further, I started to smell something strange. It was a strong, metallic smell like iron. It grew stronger with each step I took, and it made my stomach twist. I knew I should head back to camp. When I returned, my grandmother was sitting by the fire like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had. We ate a quiet dinner, and I didn't say anything about the strange smell or the silence in the woods. The night was colder than the last, so we went to bed early. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned out, and everything was completely dark. I lay there for a minute, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then I realized there was no wind at all. The trees were completely still. The rustling grew louder, like something or someone was moving through the woods, heading toward our campsite. My heart started racing. I lay as still as possible, listening. The sound was slow, like careful steps, moving closer with each second. I strained to see through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped, right at the edge of our campsite. I could hear breathing slow and steady, just outside the tent. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too controlled. I barely breathed, hoping whoever or whatever it was would just move on. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, but the breathing didn't go away. It lingered, like it was watching us, waiting for something. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Was it just someone passing by? Or was it something else? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Finally, the breathing stopped. I didn't hear any footsteps or rustling after that, just complete silence. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to my grandmother. We packed up and left the campsite like we had planned. But as we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I kept looking back at the woods, wondering if whatever was out there had watched us leave. Even now, I still think about it, about how it had stood just outside our tent, watching, breathing, and I can't help but wonder if it followed us. If it's still waiting, somewhere close, watching again when I least expect it. That silence in the woods wasn't just strange. It felt like a warning. And now, every time I think of those woods, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind, something that hasn't finished with me yet. I was 8 years old the summer my parents took us camping in the woods. My little sister, Mia, and I were really excited. We set up our tent by the river, with the sun shining bright. I could hear the water rushing and the birds singing. At night, our parents made a campfire, and we roasted marshmallows while laughing and sharing stories. After a few days of hiking and exploring, everything changed. One evening, as the sun began to set, I saw a man standing far down the riverbank. He wore old, dirty clothes. He just stood there, staring at our campsite. A chill ran down my back. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the tent, listening to the sounds outside. The leaves rustled, and the hooting of owls sounded different. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Mia was fast asleep next to me, but I couldn't close my eyes. The moonlight came through the thin fabric of the tent, and I kept looking at the entrance, half expecting to see him standing there. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a low rustling near the tent. My heart raced. I was too scared to move or make a sound. The noise got louder and closer. I held my breath and listened hard. Then I heard it, footsteps crunching on the twigs outside. My stomach dropped. I wanted to wake my parents, but I didn't want to scare Mia. So I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight lit up the campsite. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The fire was now just glowing embers, casting flickering shadows on the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again, the man. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us. I could barely breathe. Panic shot through me, and I quickly zipped the tent shut and shook Mia awake. She blinked at me, still half asleep. "Stay quiet," I whispered, pointing at the entrance. We huddled together, hearts pounding like drums. The footsteps grew closer again, and I felt frozen with fear. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, and everything went silent. We waited in silence for what felt like forever. I thought my heart might burst from the tension. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the footsteps retreating back into the woods. I waited a few more moments, then quietly unzipped the tent again. The man was gone. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. They were worried but thought I was just imagining things. We packed up our gear and headed home, but I kept glancing back at the woods, half expecting to see the man again. The trees felt darker, more menacing, as if they were hiding something. Years later, I still remember that night. I learned that not everything is as it seems. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see. Camping became a mix of fun and fear for me. I loved being outdoors, but that experience taught me to always be aware and to trust my instincts. Every time I go camping now, I remember that man watching from the shadows. There's a voice in my head that whispers to be careful, to never let my guard down. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the darkness. That fear sticks with you, like a cold wind that never quite goes away. It's a reminder that sometimes the woods hold secrets better left untouched, and that some eyes might still be watching, even when you think you're alone. I had gone camping in the woods plenty of times, but this trip felt different. The trail I followed went deep into the forest, far from the usual campsites. It was a place where no one seemed to go. I had planned to stay a couple of nights, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the trees. The first night was calm. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the only sound was the distant rustling of the leaves. I set up my camp in a small clearing, far off from any paths. It was isolated, which was what I wanted. I made a small fire, ate my dinner, and spent some time staring at the stars before crawling into my tent to sleep. I woke up early the next morning, everything still quiet. After breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. The deeper I went into the woods, the more strange it felt. The trees here were much bigger and older, and the air seemed heavier, almost thick. There were no birds or bugs making noise, which struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. After walking for a few hours, I got this weird feeling, like I was being watched. Every step I took, the feeling got worse. I didn't see anyone or anything, but it was like the air was heavy around me. You can't describe it, but you know it's there. By the time I made it back to my camp, it was late afternoon. The sky had started to cloud up, and the air felt cooler. I felt uneasy, like maybe I shouldn't have gone so far out, but I pushed the thought aside. I got ready for another quiet night, but as I walked around my camp, something felt off. My tent was still zipped shut like I had left it, but the fire pit looked messed up. There were small branches broken around the camp, ones I didn't remember seeing before. As the sun began to set, that creepy feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. The air felt colder, more than it should have been. I built up the fire, trying to shake off the unease, but I kept looking into the trees. Everything seemed still, too still. No movement, no sound. Just the fire crackling as the darkness closed in. Around midnight, I heard something, a faint snap, like a branch breaking. My heart started racing. I listened, but nothing followed. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. It wasn't random noise. It was slow and careful. It didn't sound like an animal at all. It sounded like footsteps, steady and trying not to be noticed. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but I couldn't see anything. Just shadows, branches swaying a little in the wind. I tried to calm down, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was letting my nerves get the best of me. But then the footsteps came again, this time circling my camp. They moved slowly, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My stomach tightened, and my hands started to shake. I was out here alone, far from anyone, and something or someone was out there with me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gripping the flashlight in my hand, listening to those footsteps. They never came closer, just circled over and over again all night long. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to show through the trees that the footsteps stopped. The woods went silent again, but that didn't make me feel any better. I packed up my stuff as fast as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast or cleaning up. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole time I packed, that feeling stayed with me, like something was still watching from the trees. I kept glancing around, but I didn't see anything. I started hiking back to my car, not stopping once. The entire way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I never saw anything, and I never heard those footsteps again. But I could feel it just outside of view, sticking to the shadows. When I finally reached my car, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that I was leaving, but fear that whatever had followed me wasn't done yet. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan on ever going back. Some places aren't meant for people to visit. There are parts of the woods where the quiet isn't peaceful. It's something else. I don't know what was out there with me, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that it let me leave. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps, slow and steady, somewhere just out of sight. I can't help but wonder if it's waiting for me to come back. I had been excited about this camping trip for weeks. My boss, a tough guy named Mark, invited me to join him and a couple of his friends for the weekend in the woods. I thought it would be a good chance to connect outside the office. We got to the campsite late in the afternoon. The trees stood tall around us, their branches heavy with leaves that rustled in the wind. We set up our tents, the noise of our gear echoing in the quiet. Mark took charge, organizing everything with a strict attitude. He was always the boss, but here in the woods, his control felt different, almost too much. As night came, we gathered around the fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the ground. Mark told stories about the outdoors, his hunting trips, and the risks of the wild. He talked about bears, snakes, and even a time he got lost for hours. I felt a shiver go through me. The stories were meant to be fun, but the way he shared them made it seem like something bad could happen at any moment. Eventually, we settled down for the night. I crawled into my tent, tired from the day. But sleep didn't come easily. I heard the crackling of leaves outside and the distant hoot of an owl. Just as I started to drift off, I heard something else. A soft rustling, closer this time. My heart raced. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, almost like something was circling our campsite. I unzipped the tent just a bit, peeking outside. The fire had burned down, leaving only glowing coals. The dark shapes of trees surrounded us, and I could see a shadow moving just beyond the light. I felt cold sweat form on my forehead. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, trying to tell myself it was nothing, but the rustling continued. It felt intentional, as if whatever it was trying to find us. Then I heard a heavy thump, a footstep. Panic gripped me. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone but remembered there was no signal out here. I decided to wake Mark, thinking he would know what to do. I unzipped my tent quietly and crawled out, the cool night air hitting my skin. As I made my way to Mark's tent, the rustling grew louder. My gut twisted with fear. I hesitated but pressed on, hoping he would ease my worries. I reached his tent and tapped gently, then harder, hoping he'd hear me over the sounds of the night. After what felt like forever, Mark emerged, his face lit by the moonlight. Just as I opened my mouth to tell him what I had heard, a loud crash echoed from the woods behind us. It sounded like a tree falling, but it was too close for comfort. Mark's eyes widened, and he immediately grew serious. "Get back in your tent," he said sharply. His tone sent chills through me, but I couldn't just obey. Something was out there, and it felt wrong. The crash had startled something, and I could hear heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush now. The noise was unmistakably close. I felt frozen with fear. Mark grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Suddenly, we saw it, a huge shape moving away from the campsite. It was far too big to be a bear, its outline massive against the night sky. We stood still, the air thick with dread, unable to move or speak. Mark didn't waste time. He told us to pack up quickly. I acted on instinct, throwing my stuff into my bag. The rustling was growing louder, almost closing in on us. It felt as if the forest was alive and aware, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. With everything packed, we hurried to the car. Mark's earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a fear I had never seen in him before. As we drove away, I glanced back at the campsite. The trees stood silent, but I felt deep in my bones that something had been watching us from the shadows. We drove for miles, the road winding away from that dark place. The night felt heavy behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still lurking in the woods, ready for the next unsuspecting camper. As I stared out the window, I realized I wouldn't forget that night anytime soon. It hit me then. The forest holds secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left undisturbed. There's a darkness out there that knows no boundaries, a lurking presence that waits for the careless and the naive. We had escaped this time, but the fear lingered, a chilling reminder that danger can hide just beyond the trees, watching and waiting, ready to pounce when you least expect it.